Bien, los
Interpersonal exchanges can occur in two different ways. They can occur by mutual agreement between the parties, that is, voluntarily, or they can involve coercion.
también el
An act of coercion also constitutes an exchange, even if it is a forced exchange. If I'm walking down the street and suddenly some muggers appear and say to me, "Your money or your life," think about it. They've got a gun to my head. I have two alternatives. I either hand over my wallet or they shoot and kill me. So I have to choose. If the threat is believable, I hand over my wallet in exchange for my life. In the case of a mugging, the approach is quite clear. Your money or your life. There is an exchange. The same is true in the case of rape, etc. This second type of exchange differs radically from the first type we mentioned. An exchange which takes place voluntarily, in other words, by mutual agreement between the parties. We will refer to a society, or process of human interaction, in which voluntary exchanges predominate as a society based on contractual ties, and we will refer to a society in which coercive exchanges predominate as a society based on hegemonic ties. The essential difference between one type of exchange, the voluntary type, and the other, the coercive type, lies in whether or not physical violence is used or threatened. This is a very important point. If there is no physical violence, nor a threat of physical violence, and it must be discernible, observable from the outside. If we cannot perceive any physical violence nor threat of it, then the exchange is voluntary. If we do observe physical violence or a threat of physical violence, like someone putting a gun to our heads, then the exchange is coercive. What I'm saying, in a nutshell, is that the difference between one type of exchange, the voluntary type, and the other, the coercive type, must be clear and obvious from the outside. There must be physical contact. Look, forgive me for bothering you. I'm using you to illustrate my point. Physical contact or a gun. A threat. Why am I dwelling on this? Why am I emphasizing the importance of contact, of actual physical violence? That, or the threat of physical violence, is key. I am emphasizing the point because any exchange that occurs without physical violence or the threat of it is a voluntary exchange by definition, an exchange by mutual agreement. So, we're not talking about internal violence. For instance, I have a very large family, 6 children to feed. Whenever I come home, "Daddy, Daddy," I can see them suffering, and I'm out of a job. I'm in such a desperate situation that I'm compelled to take a terrible job that pays only €1 an hour. Someone in that situation might say, "I'm forced to." But is this coercion? No. In economic theory, we deal with human relationships. And there is a clear difference between the use or threat of violence, quite obviously a coercive exchange, which gives rise to a society based on hegemonic ties, and voluntary exchanges, regardless of the specific array of inner circumstances that might lead me to make a decision about an exchange. I'm going to get married. It's perfectly obvious. If I marry at gunpoint or under threat of violence, the exchange is coercive. But if I'm simple-minded, and my mother pressures me all day long to get married, and my friends do too, and I see myself as the black sheep of the family, and finally I'm compelled to marry, it is only in a figurative sense that I am compelled. From our point of view as social scientists, since there is no physical coercion, nor a threat of physical violence, the exchange, or the action, is voluntary. I mention it because there is a huge amount of manipulation in this regard, in both language and the interpretation of events. Many people, precisely to justify violence and coercion, resort to misrepresenting exchanges as forced, when really they are not. The difference must be objectively discernible to an outside observer, physical violence or the threat of physical violence. Logically, if some people kidnap one of my children and tell me they're going to kill my child if I don't do this or that, it is identical or comparable to their holding a gun to my head. I make the point because this difference will distinguish between a society based on contractual ties and a society based on hegemonic ties. Also, the enemies of a free society invariably turn to the old, stale, false and fallacious claim that the freedom or the voluntary nature of exchanges in open societies is merely a matter of form, because ultimately workers are forced to take terrible jobs, etc. Forced by whom? Who puts a gun to their heads? And this claim is used to justify a society that truly is based on hegemonic ties. Its supporters call it the dictatorship of the proletariat. And there, guns held to people's heads and shots in the back of the neck really do prevail. Notice the paradox.